Hello, everyone. Happy December. I would like to start with the month spirit. Nice to meet you all. My name is Chandrani Banerjee. Past 25 years I'm in education and 10 years in PYP. Few things about me. Uh, I love road trips. I'm a plant enthusiast. I'm a big fan of Twitter, and I share my views and all through Twitter. And my collaboration online sharing happens through Twitter and LinkedIn. By end of today's session, we will be reflecting, discussing on why, how, and what is inclusion and inclusive classroom, removing and reducing barriers, role of ICT in inclusive classroom, designing and arranging your inclusive classroom. Before we jump in, I would request you all to see this picture very carefully, and if you can reflect, if you can write your opinion in the chat. What do you think? Does it look like your school, your classroom, or somewhere you can relate with the picture? I would like to read your valuable reflection in the chat. So it will be great if you like whichever picture you relate, and if you can just write a few line about it. Does it look in your classroom it's happening, or in your school you have that kind of practice? If you can reflect, it will be great. Let us think about why inclusion. The IB believes in an inclusive approach to education designed to remove or reduce barrier so that every student can fully participate in IB programs. Inclusion in education. A human right in UNESCO views inclusion as a dynamic approach to responding positively to people diversity and of seeing individual differences not as problems but as opportunities for enriching learning. How is inclusion defined? Inclusion is seen as a process of addressing and responding to the diversity of needs of all learners through increasing participation in learning, cultures, communities, and reducing exclusion within and from education. It involves changes and modification in content, approaches, structures, and strategies with a common vision which covers all children of the appropriate age range. Inclusive education is an approach that looks into how to transform education system and other learning environment in order to respond to the diversity of learners. What inclusion is about? Inclusion is about welcoming diversity. It's not about reforms of special education alone, but reform of both the formal and non-formal education system, benefiting all learners, not only targeting the excluded. It's not about meeting the needs of children with disabilities only. It's about collecting, collating and evaluating information from a wide variety of sources in order to plan for improvement in policy and practices. Let us see a small video and let us learn more about inclusive classroom. This is a true story which was made. The boy in this video is the character based on the story was made. So at the end of the video, I'm sure you must have seen something happening. I will request everyone to find one word to explain that what you felt the last clipping from this video. So the one word coming in your mind, which right now you're experiencing, I'm sure the video must have some information into it. One word would you like to write here in the comment section? Let's talk about removing and reducing barriers, which we often face during our teaching learning journey. I will request everybody to write one word coming in your mind after seeing this video to understand more about barriers. As access arrangements serve to reduce or remove barriers to learning, the first step in planning for access arrangements is to identify the barriers. Observation of the student in the classroom, information from past teachers, parents, legal guardian, or the student about previously identified challenges, anecdotal information from parents, legal guardians about what they currently observe at home, combined with reports from professionals such as psychologists and doctors, will all help to identify the barriers. To understand more about inclusive classroom, we must identify the challenges and the barriers children face. The following tables list some example of some primary barriers, their sub areas and associated secondary barriers. In case of student 1, if you see the child is in the withdrawal or isolation position, the primary barrier here is processing information. If you notice, the student 5 facing the emotional disturbance in class associated with the primary barrier as cultural variations, which leading to socio communication. I will request everybody to take a look of this list to understand what type of barrier our children they face and what we see in the classroom on daily basis. Here, student 6, if you see the writing and writing fluency is coming as a secondary barrier, is facing issues with speech and language as a primary barrier. This model of inclusive access arrangements shows a student when enroll in an IB program, we take the information about children to identify his or her strength or challenges. We at MLSI, when we take admission, we make sure our learning support team is with us so that we can easily identify the strength of the child or the challenges the child is facing. In case we did not get the information from the parents, then we request them to provide us the information about his challenges or what he faced from his past school experience. In this chat, if you see, every stage of trial and implementing teaching and learning, there, if we have access to arrangement support, then we are moving to the next level. In case we could not meet the requirement, then we are going to identify the appropriate arrangement which is in line with IB inclusion policy. I'm sure every IB school, we have IB inclusion policy, which helps us to move ahead with this sequence. Let me tell you, the last stage where the implementation for IB summative assessment area is mentioned is not applicable for PYP setup. The diagram here on the page traces the stages of understanding in the move towards inclusion. It demonstrates that the attitude in society direct the actions, the level of commitment and services provide to traditionally excluded groups. However, this schema is merely an example of a general process which may differ from country to country. Here, if you see the initial stage where we always face the denial mode, we often face this stage where the person or the parent community or the student always in the denial mode before they are accepting or understanding their need. Very important aspect we will be looking at today, role of ICT in inclusive classroom. If you see the table closely, the variable here are teacher's role, learning, criteria for success, type of knowledge, assessment, instructional paradigm, grouping, and student activity. Here, teacher role is changing from expert to collaborator through the integration of technology. Teachers becoming more like a resource person instead of the expert in their own field. The learning is becoming focused on the student instead of focused on the teacher. The criteria for assessment here demonstrate growth and personal abilities instead of demonstrating full competences. The type of knowledge here children get is construction or mental representation of meanings instead of acquisition, accumulation, or reproduction of data. Assessments are based on the student's performance of real task instead of based on test. Instructional paradigm is based on process instead of content oriented. It is moreover student centered instead of teacher oriented. The grouping is becoming heterogeneous instead of homogeneous. The student activity is here taking shape of group work instead of having personal work. The changes in the learning process caused by information age, from teacher-centered instruction to student-centered learning. Now, the important thing is that the student learns and all element of the educative systems are subordinated to this process of learning, including the teacher and the education itself. The roles of a teacher and a student are interchangeable. Teachers become the facilitators of learning and are no more the sole authoritative source. From content based classes to process oriented lessons, there has been a conceptual change that does not interpret the learning as acquisition, accumulation, or reproduction of informative data, but as construction of mental representation of meanings. This conception of education uses suitable strategies to relate, combine, and transform the knowledge. It is something dynamic. It is rather a question than an answer, a process than a product. Learners are engaged in tasks that are authentic and bear direct relationship to meaningful and relevant tasks in the real world. How differentiation helps inclusion. Differentiated instruction involves responding effectively to the differences that exist among learners in the classroom. According to Tomlinson, teachers differentiate when they reach out to an individual or small group by varying their teaching in order to create the best learning experience possible. Inclusive schooling that is strengthened by differentiated instruction enables support learners with the full range of abilities in general education, from gifted to those with the most severe disabilities. Now let us see how can we uh, design and arrange our classroom as inclusive classroom. I listed here three small category. Uh, Under first category, it is small group. We can have tables available for small group instruction and collaboration in our classroom. Uh, we also can have dedicated one open area in the back of our classroom for social skill instruction, role plays, or other activities. The area where we keep our instructional materials and displays should change time to time. Frequently rotate displays of student projects and papers so that everyone gets a chance to have their work spotlighted. We must post our classroom schedule and expectation, which is simply worded for them. We must check the handouts and the lesson materials if it is inclusive in nature. Inclusive education is about improving the learning environments, but also about providing opportunities for all learners to become successful in their learning experiences. Let us see a few more points which we can include in our daily classroom. Support learner agency in the classroom. Allow grouping and regrouping. Create opportunity to listen every learners. I remember like often teachers sit in morning meeting. That is the time best way you can discuss, you can ask children what they feel, what they uh, are happy about. The maximum information you will get when you are sitting in a group. The early morning circle time is one routine which helps us to understand our learner. Be aware of the specific needs of every learner. So when I see this point, it reminds me the relationship we share with our learner. The teacher and student relationship matters here a lot to understand the child's specific needs. The point where we see create a calm environment, it actually helps the learner to think, to feel comfortable, to feel valued. We must use prior knowledge assessment to plan our next level. The prior knowledge assessment helps us to understand their level of understanding or what they need. Pre-teach as and when required to support learners. The mini lessons are often used for pre-teaching where it is necessary. So if the child is pre-equipped by knowledge, it helps them to understand during their class session period. Use more manipulatives to allow hands-on approaches. When I talk about manipulatives, I often see educators, school having manipulatives more in the subject area mathematics. But when I talk about manipulatives, I talk about every subject areas. More number in manipulatives helps children to build their social skill, their communication skill, their thinking skill. They sit in a small group and their hands on activities promote their understanding. Use centers for learning materials and task card. Often it is seen center based learning is helping a lot. You can use it as a morning routine or before they leave the school. School must consider the social and emotional needs of the child. For that matter, we should organize time to time educational sessions where the emotional needs are taken care. Differentiate instruction is a must. It helps the child to participate wholeheartedly. Collaborative setup in the classroom helps them to think, rethink, and group and feel comfortable expressing their ideas. Use of gamification often seen as a support to motivate our learners, to make them feeling they can do everything, to make the learning more engaging. The gamification, if you see in the learning and teaching method, it often used to introduce or as a recap during the session. more number of use in graphic organizer or VTR actually helps children to think about what they are learning. They reflect their understanding where they are facing their challenges through these routines. I would request today's participant to reflect their comment if they have used any strategies in their classroom based on all these listed here and how it impacted their day-to-day teaching. I would like to pause here. Any graphic organizer or any VTR, if you have used in your classroom where you have seen the changes, how it used to be initially, and after using all these, you have seen the changes of learning environment. You can list down few of them. Till then, we will move ahead. Before I start this video, I would like to request everybody to take a note of what inclusive classroom design is stating in this video. If you relate to it, kindly share your ideas in the chat so that we can learn from each other.
Inclusive classroom design is when an instructor intentionally plans that their class is going to be accessible to all types of learners in their classroom.
As soon as we start talking about that issue, we get into the idea of things like privilege and oppression. But for the most part, what we're really looking at is what attributes of the students are necessary for us to pay attention to in order for them to be successful.
By including the majority of the most people that you can in the design of whatever you're doing, you effectively reach more people than you would otherwise.
So we really need to look at the whole student and make sure we're supporting them in ways that are necessary for them to develop as students and as individuals.
Well, the benefits of inclusive pedagogy for students is that they are going to, first of all, enter into the learning experience from a place that feels comfortable to them, where they can feel successful. At the same time, because it uses multiple modes of delivery, for example, it also helps the student to maybe develop their capacities in other ways of thinking and learning where perhaps they aren't as strong.
Some of the benefits for students include the idea that we hear their voice. One of the things we know when we take a look at students in a broad perspective is some voices are privileged and some aren't. So as we begin to think about teaching in an inclusive perspective, everybody's voice gets heard, but it also gets valued and understood.
So what do you do to create a class where students feel their voice matters?
I would like to stop here to know, like a valid question was asked here, that what do you do in your class to make sure that your children's voice is heard? So can you reflect on it? What opportunities you provide so that they feel that they are valued, they feel they are included? I will request all participants to write their reflecting on this area, that how do you make sure that your children are included and their voice is valued?
Sometimes it's as simple as learning every student's name. But then that, of course, inclusive pedagogy is about much more than just knowing everyone's name. But it's that creating an environment where people feel like they belong.
Typically in higher education, a student identifies a disability if that student wants a service. But just because they don't ask for a service doesn't mean that they don't need it.
An inclusive classroom provides an environment where any student can succeed, even if they don't know their disability, they do not have a disability, they have a disability and they are just not comfortable talking to the professor, or they're very comfortable talking to the professor.
Inclusive design relative to professors allows us to better reach our students. Rather than thinking about our students as a small group or that everybody's the same, we want to think about them from a broad perspective. So really the first benefit is we get better learning with our students.
So for example, if you have a student who requires visual information to be displayed in a particular way because they have a visual impairment, okay, the whole class then actually benefits. So there may be other people who benefit from this other way of presenting the information, maybe not because they have a visual impairment, but because maybe they learn differently, or maybe it reinforces how they are taking in information in another way.
The second is our students will tend to engage more, which makes teaching more fun, to be quite honest with you, instead of students just kind of hanging out in class for 50 minutes or an hour and 25.
The instructor also has the assurance that they are treating every student with dignity and respect. And that's part of the principles of community here at Virginia Tech.
Conventional ways of teaching is a lecture. So you have an expert who conveys information, and hopefully they're a very compelling speaker and they know their information well. So that's a great mode of delivery for students who learn best by listening. It may not be as effective for a student who needs to see a process written out, for example, or a student who learns best by doing something.
So from the beginning, try to create activities that allow students to engage with the material in more than one way. So using more than one sense, listening and writing, for example.
If I were to give advice to someone who wants to consider inclusive pedagogy for their class, I would begin by asking them, what is your experience of a learning situation where you really felt engaged and included? And if you think about that experience, that time when you were in that learning situation and how exciting it was and what it did for you as a learner, and then assess what were the features of that environment, you are beginning to identify what it means to do inclusive pedagogy.
If a teacher wants to make their course more accessible, it certainly can be overwhelming to think about. And so probably the first place that I would start would be to look at the syllabus for your course and make sure you have a statement for students with disabilities so that they know that they can come to you during office hours and talk to you about what accommodations they may need in your classroom. The other thing that I would recommend would be to make sure that all of the content that you're providing to the class is accessible. So things like if you are going to be distributing PDF documents, make sure that they are accessible so that if a student has to use a screen reader or software on their computer to read it back to them, that they would be able to do that because the document is accessible.
Always save documents as PDFs instead of print to PDF. It's an interesting difference, and you wouldn't think it would matter, but when you save to PDF, anything that's built into the document stays in the document. If you print to PDF, it's a lot like a photocopier. All it does is take a picture and print it out. The last thing that faculty can bear in mind is to avoid communicating in only one way. So a good example of this is sometimes faculty will use color or color coding to represent some kind of organization on a chalkboard or a whiteboard or a digital board. but not all students can see all color spectrums. And just because you can't see all color spectrums doesn't mean that you're going to identify that to the professor. So simple ways that professors could deal with that example are, if I'm going to color code something, I could also underline, box, squiggle, any way to represent in more than one way what I'm trying to communicate. The same thing goes for communications using contractions or pronouns. So for example, if I'm a student who has low vision or blindness, or I'm a student who's learning English, this and that don't always mean anything to me.
The last thing that I would say is that if you have any guest speakers in your class, it's always a good idea to check with them beforehand to see if they plan on passing out any handouts, or if they're going to be showing a PowerPoint or a video, to check with them to make sure that their material is going to be accessible to all of the students in your class.
Documents in particular, we use a lot of documents in our curriculum, from PowerPoint presentations to Word documents, PDF documents, and all the other varieties that there are. And those documents, if you don't build accessibility into them, anyone who's using assistive technology essentially sees a blank piece of paper. And for all of the effort that faculty put into their curriculum, it really ought to be enjoyed by their students.
When you look at inclusive design versus accommodation, you see some stark differences. Accommodation puts all of the onus onto the student to be an advocate that for themselves. That implies two main things about the student. One, that they can actually be their own advocate, that they feel comfortable enough to talk to their professor with that different power dynamic, and actually be able to talk to the professor about something that they need them to do. And it also implies that the student is comfortable with their disability and they know that they have a disability.
I think for a lot of faculty, shifting from focusing on content to really trying to integrate diversity can be a little scary, can be a little uncomfortable. And it's important to understand that that discomfort is a good thing. That means we're focused on change, and that there are lots of people around to support that. And so if they come and they talk to us, they talk to TLS, they talk to Office of Diversity and Inclusion, they find other faculty that they're working with as a support group, which sounds kind of odd, but really when we're venturing into new areas, it's important to develop a support group. So to recognize at the beginning, it could be a little odd or discomforting, and that's okay.
Very insightful video. I'm sure you all enjoyed watching it. Someone very nicely said about inclusion. It is really impacted me. According to Rachel, inclusion is not bringing people into what already exists. It is making a new space, a better space for everyone. So we often talk about students who all are struggling, which is visible. You often see them and you can easily identify their challenges. But when your classroom is inclusive, you are taking those learners also into your circle where their emotional well-being matters. So in this session, I have used all these resources. I'm thankful to my school, Mount Litera School International. I'm thankful to my college, Pillai College of Education, and all other blogs which I have used for today's session. I would request everyone to reflect about today's teaching and learning together. in Padlet, which very shortly will be shared by Ashnaha. So I want together, let us create some sort of understanding. Remember one thing, inclusion is nothing but understanding each learner, understanding their need, understanding what really they are struggling with. So I'm sure you all have some experience in your uh, teaching and learning journey. Let us together discuss and grow as a learning community. Thank you so much for staying together in today's session. If you have any questions or any thing to share with me, you can email me at chandrani.banerjee@mlsi.in. And in case you have any other insight to share, you can surely share it in our Padlet, which is just now posted by Asnaha. Thank you so much.